9 years from now, Elias Finch will stand on a ship deck about to break apart beneath his feet, while the woman he once helped from the mud will return as the captain who decides if 200 men live or drown. The price of a small act of kindness is about to be called in. The night smelled like a shipwreck in progress. Brine, kerosene, and the metallic bite of coming lightning. Elias Finch tasted it on every breath as he trudged the coast road, boots slurping in ankle-deep muck, lanterns swinging in a futile fight against the dark. A single thought hammered with the rain. Catch the tide or lose the quartermaster's berth he'd hunted for 3 years. Behind him, the harbor bell tolled 8, 2 clangs from missing the boat. He lengthened his stride. Then the lantern beam caught her. A lone figure in a sodden cloak. Half the size of the wagon, she struggled to free from the mud's greedy fist. One wheel buried to the hub, cargo tarp flapping like a wounded gull. She threw her shoulder against the tailgate. The wagon only sank deeper, giving a wet, satisfied sigh. Elias almost walked past. Almost. He tasted the salt of his own sweat now, mingling with rain that sliced sideways off the Atlantic. The woman's knuckles. He saw them in the lantern's halo, were torn open, blood running in thin pink threads across her skin. She didn't make a sound, just dug in again, boots sliding, the wagon unmoved. His captain's voice roared in memory. Late hands get left, Finch. Tide waits for no man. But the blood reached Elias's boot before he took another step. 1 drop. 2. A tiny constellation of red in the lantern glow. He exhaled a curse that fogged the air and turned back. The woman startled when his gloved hand closed around the wagon shaft beside hers. Rain plastered dark curls across her face. Eyes the color of storm water flashed surprise, then gratitude gone fierce. "I can manage," she rasped. "Not in this lifetime," Elias said. He wedged his shoulder beneath the tongue. Cold iron bit through coat and skin. Mud sucked at his boots like the sea itself trying to pull him under. Together they heaved. The wagon groaned, shifted an inch, then settled deeper with a wet glug. The woman's breath hitched. Pain flickered across her features. Elias glanced at the cargo. Barrels of salted fish, the kind that kept whole villages alive through winter. If they spoiled here, she'd lose everything. Thunder rolled overhead, a low growl that vibrated in his teeth. He tasted lightning before it struck. Another heave. His muscles screamed. The wagon lurched. Metal shrieked against stone, and suddenly lurched free with a sound like the earth giving up a secret. The woman staggered, catching herself on the wagon side. Blood dripped from her palm onto the flatbed, mixing with rain, vanishing into the grain of the wood. She straightened, chest heaving, and met his eyes. "You'll miss your ship." The words hit like a slap. Elias spun toward the harbor. Through sheets of rain he could just make out the 3 masts of the North Star. Lanterns bobbing as sailors hauled lines, the silhouette shrinking against black water. He was late. The woman reached into her cloak, fingers trembling. She withdrew something small and pale, pressed it into his palm. A whale tooth, carved with a breaching whale beneath a single star. Warm despite the storm. "For luck," she said. "And for debt." Before he could answer, she flicked the reins. The wagon wheels spat mud. She vanished into the dark like a ghost swallowed by weather. Elias stood alone, rain drumming the tooth in his fist. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the North Star's bell rang a final farewell. He ran, boots slipping, lungs burning, lanterns swinging wild arcs of light across the dunes. The ship's lanterns shrank to pinpricks, then winked out behind a curtain of storm. He was stranded. In the sudden hush, only waves and wind remained. He opened his fist. The whale tooth glimmered, slick with rain and his own blood from the wagon iron. A single thought, cold as the Atlantic. That stranger's debt just cost him everything. Voiceover whispers, low and urgent. 9 years from tonight, Elias Finch will stand on a deck breaking apart beneath his feet. The same stranger will return, not as the woman in the mud, but as the captain, who decides whether 200 men live or drown. And the whale tooth will still hang around his neck. The screen freezes on Elias's face. Rain streaking, eyes wide with the dawning weight of what kindness can cost. Text flashes. Tell me, would you have stopped? Type yes or no before the storm clears. The harbor bell tolled again. Two metallic cracks that punched through wind and rain like hammer blows on Elias Finch's conscience. 8 bells gone. The North Star had already slipped her last mooring and drifted into the channel, her lanterns shrinking to ember dots that bobbed once, twice, then vanished behind a curtain of black water. He stood on the pier like a statue carved from salt and regret. Behind him, the town's night watchman rattled his keys and laughed. Tide waits for no man, sailor. Should have left the girl to the mud. Elias's fingers tightened around the whale tooth. It was still warm, as if it carried the woman's pulse instead of his own. Carved into the ivory was a single star flanked by breaching whales. Delicate, deliberate, impossible to fake. A promise or a curse, he couldn't decide. Water slapped the pilings with hungry jaws. Somewhere out in the darkness, the North Star's sails filled eastward wind. Java, Manila, Canton. Without that berth, Elias had no passage, no pay, no future beyond the next tavern floor. He spun back toward the coast road. The wagon tracks were already filling with rain, soft edges erasing the evidence that the woman had ever existed. Still, he followed. Not out of charity now, out of desperation. The tooth felt heavier with every step, a lead weight dragging him inland while his ship sailed farther from reach. Mud sucked at his boots. The lantern's flame guttered, painting the puddles in blood-red streaks. He rehearsed excuses. I helped her, now she helps me, fair trade. But the truth tasted like rust. He needed the stranger more than she'd ever needed him. Up ahead, lantern light pooled outside the Blue Anchor Inn. A cluster of fishermen's wives huddled beneath the eaves, voices sharp with rumor. Said she bought the whole cargo herself. Paid in coin none of us have seen before. Foreign silver, stamped with a whale. Elias's heart kicked. He pushed through the circle. Inside, the common room reeked of wet wool and pipe smoke. At the far table sat the woman. Cloak thrown back, hair unbound and dripping, a line of salt crusting her temple like frost. 3 barrels of salted fish were stacked beside her. She was counting coins onto the scarred wood, each one catching the firelight like a tiny moon. He crossed the room in 4 strides. You cost me my ship. The woman looked up. Storm-colored eyes met his, calm and unflinching. And you saved my winter. Debts cut both ways, sailor. She flicked one of the coins toward him. It spun across the table, clinking to a stop against the whale tooth still clenched in his fist. The silver bore the same star and whale design. Elias stared. Where did you get these? From the captain who owes me passage. He'll be docking at first light. His hold is half empty, storm damage in the North Channel. You want a berth? Be on the pier at dawn. Hope flared, then curdled. I've no coin left. You took my last chance. She leaned forward, voice low enough that the room's chatter couldn't catch it. Then take the chance I'm offering. But know this. Once you sail with Captain Moreau, you're bound to more than canvas and wind. You're bound to the tooth, and the debt that carved it. Outside, the storm doubled its fists against the shutters. Somewhere in the harbor, the North Star's wake had already cooled into black water. Elias's thumb traced the ivory star. The choice crystallized: stay and starve or sail into a bargain he didn't understand. The innkeeper rang last bell. The woman rose, pulling her cloak tight. Dawn tide. Don't be late. As she passed, her shoulder brushed his. The whale tooth hummed against his chest, as if the storm itself whispered through its carved grooves. He watched her disappear up the stairs, lantern light catching the blood on her palm. Still fresh, still his. Voiceover soft. By sunrise, Elias Finch would sign his name to a contract inked in salt and starlight. And 9 years later, when the sandbank rose like a jagged tooth from the Java Sea, he would learn the true price of that signature. Cut to the empty dock. Rain drumming on planks. Whale tooth glowing faintly in Elias's pocket. Text flashes. Would you board the unknown at dawn? Or wait for a ship that's already gone? Tell me below. before the tide decides for you. 9 years collapsed into the roar of a single typhoon. Elias Finch tasted salt and kerosene as the Java Sea hurled the coral which sideways onto a hidden sandbank. The impact slammed his teeth together. Blood bloomed copper across his tongue. Timbers screamed. A wall of green water vaulted the bow and crashed down the deck like a living thing, snatching 2 sailors into the dark before they could scream. Somewhere in the chaos, the whale tooth thumped against his breastbone. Still strung on the same salt-stiffened cord Lila had pressed into his palm all those nights ago. Above the howl of wind came a voice he hadn't heard in almost a decade, clear, commanding, unmistakable. Hard starboard. Cut the staysail. Bosun, get those pumps running or we'll all feed the sharks. He spun, water streaming from his beard. On the quarterdeck stood Captain Lila Moreau, rain plastering her dark hair to her skull, eyes the color of storm water flashing the same unflinching steel he remembered. The cloak was gone. In its place, a naval coat too big for her frame and a cutlass she wielded like an extension of her arm. Power had flipped like a coin. The coral which lurched again. A thunderous crack. Mainmast splintered, canvas whipping wild serpents across the deck. Elias ducked under the flailing boom and sprinted toward the quarterdeck. Each footfall sent shockwaves through the hull as the sandbank ground the keel like a predator worrying bone. "Captain!" he shouted over the wind. Lila's gaze snapped to him. Recognition flared, shock, then something deeper. Her eyes dropped to the whale tooth bouncing against his chest. For half a heartbeat the storm fell away. Only the tooth and the debt it carried hung between them. "Thought you'd be halfway to Canton by now," she yelled. "Thought you'd be on land counting coin," he shot back. Another wave slammed the port side. The deck tilted 30 degrees. Barrels of whale oil broke their lashings and thundered across the boards, one bursting in a spray of golden fire as a lantern shattered. Flames licked toward the sail locker. Tick-tock. Lila's voice cut through the chaos. "We've 30 minutes before the next tide rips us in half. My steamer's anchored leeward, but she's half-crewed and riding heavy. Can your men still pull a line?" Elias glanced at the pumps. 2 already choked with splinters, water rising past his ankles. The crew looked to him, eyes wide, terror barely caged. "Give us rope and we'll pull the moon down if you ask," he answered. Lila nodded once, economy of gesture that hadn't changed. She unclasped the silver whale coin she now wore on a chain around her wrist and pressed it into his palm beside the carved tooth. 2 halves of the same constellation. "Then let's settle accounts, sailor." Together they plunged into the storm. Rain came sideways, stinging like buckshot. Elias led a line of men aft, boots skidding on pitching timbers, while Lila barked orders that cracked like pistol shots. They wrestled a hawser the width of a man's thigh across the gap between ships, fighting wind that wanted to fling them into the sea. The whale tooth thumped against Elias's chest with every heartbeat. Steady, insistent, alive. Flash of memory. The muddy road, her bleeding knuckles, the single star carved into ivory. He looped the hawser around the main bit and hauled until sinews screamed. The steamer's engines growled, metal grinding against strain. The coral which groaned, shifted an agonizing foot, then another. Sand hissed along the hull like a serpent. But the tide was coming fast, merciless. A wall of water taller than the forecastle reared up and crashed down, dousing the oil fire in a hiss of steam and smoke. Lila appeared beside him, cutlass now sheathed, hands bleeding from rope burn. "We've 1 shot left. When this wave hits, we cut the damaged mast. Your weight plus the steamer's pull might free us." Elias met her eyes. "And if it doesn't?" She smiled, feral, fearless. "Then we drown together, and the debt's paid in full." The next wave rose like a cathedral of water, green-black and roaring. Elias wrapped the hawser around his forearm, braced his boots against the rail. Lila's hand found his shoulder steady, grounding. Time slowed. He felt the whale tooth pulse once, warm as a heartbeat against his skin. "Cut!" Lila screamed. Axe flashed. The severed mast toppled into the sea with a thunderous splash. The steamer's engines roared. Rope snapped taut. The coral which shuddered, slid, then lurched free with a sound like the world cracking open. For one breathless moment the deck leveled. Men cheered, half sobbing. Elias looked toward the steamer's deck where Lila stood drenched, hair whipping like battle flags, eyes locked on his. The storm wasn't finished. Wind shifted. A rogue swell caught the steamer broadside, slamming it toward the freed schooner. Ropes creaked, threatening to snap. If they parted now, both ships would pile onto the submerged reef behind them. Lila's voice carried across the gap, raw but steady. "Your call, bosun. Cut loose and run, or tie fast and risk both crews." Elias's pulse hammered against the whale tooth. Voiceover whisper. One choice would save his crew. One would save hers. And in the next 30 seconds, the ocean would decide if kindness still carried interest. The screen freezes on Elias's hand gripping the hawser, rope fibers cutting into bloodied knuckles. Text flashes. "Cut or hold. Type your answer below, before the next wave decides for us." The rope screamed under tension, hemp fibers snapping one by one like distant pistol shots. Elias Finch wrapped the final coil around the iron bit and felt the whale tooth beat once against his sternum, as if the carved star itself urged him on. 30 feet away, across a heaving corridor of black water, Captain Lila Moreau braced on her steamer's quarterdeck, cutlass replaced by a length of marlin spike, her eyes never leaving his. Above them the typhoon had spent its fury. What remained was a cold, steady wind sharpening the crests into glass knives. The coral which, freed from the sandbank, wallowed low in the swell, her pumps still choking, her seams weeping. But she was alive. Lila's voice cut the wind. "Ready on your command, bosun." Elias tasted salt and blood where his lip had split. He raised a fist. "Heave together, on 3. The crews moved like a single body. 20 men on the steamer's capstan, 20 on the schooner's rail, backs bowed against the storm. The hawser, thick as a man's thigh, rose out of the water, streaming, then snapped rigid. Wood groaned, iron clanged, and slowly, impossibly, the coral which slid across the current toward the steamer's lee. Each inch was a prayer. Elias felt the rope burn through his gloves, heat flaring against raw skin. Over the grind of wind and wave he heard Lila counting, steady as a heartbeat. 1, 2, 3, heave. The rhythm became the only solid thing in a world made of motion and spray. A rogue swell lifted the schooner's stern and slammed it down. The whale tooth thumped harder, once, twice, like a second heart reminding him of a promise made in mud and lantern light. He remembered, 9 winters ago, a broken wagon wheel, her bleeding knuckles, the single carved ivory she'd pressed into his calloused palm. "Luck," she'd said. "Debt." Now the debt had come calling. The hawser creaked, stretching until individual strands snapped and whipped past like angry snakes. Elias locked eyes with Lila across the gap. She lifted her left hand. In her palm glinted the matching silver coin, whale and star, she'd worn since that night on the coast road. No words passed between them, yet everything was spoken. Another heave and the coral witch's bow kissed the steamer's fender. Lines flew. Sailors lashed the two hulls together with desperate speed. Fire still licked along the schooner's sail locker. Elias snatched a bucket, doused the flames until they hissed into steam. Smoke twisted upward, carrying the smell of burnt hemp and victory. Then the wind died. It happened all at once. Roar dropping to moan, waves flattening under a sudden hush. The sea held its breath. In the sudden quiet Elias heard his own pulse thundering against the ivory at his throat. He stepped across the joined rails. Lila met him amidships. Both were drenched, streaked with soot and blood, but her eyes held a calm fierce enough to still the storm. She reached out, fingers brushing the whale tooth. "Luck held," she said. "Luck returned," he answered. From her pocket she drew a second carving, an exact twin to the tooth he'd carried across 3 oceans. She pressed them together. The stars aligned perfectly. 2 halves, she said. One promise kept. Behind them, the crews erupted in exhausted cheers. Someone struck up a pump organ's wheezy hymn from the steamer's galley. The sound drifted over decks littered with broken spars and singed canvas. Elias looked back at the Coral which, her masts crooked, her sails shredded, but her hull intact. And for the first time in 9 years he felt something loosen inside his chest. A knot he hadn't known was tied. Lila's voice softened. "You've a berth, Bosun Finch. Long as you want it. Long as the sea remembers tonight." He laughed. Short, surprised, raw. "Reckon the sea's got a long memory." She smiled, and the scar on her left palm, where the wagon's iron had bitten, caught the lantern light. "So do I." Together they leaned on the rail. Ahead, the Java coastline glimmered faintly under clearing stars. Smoke from the doused fire curled upward, twisting into shapes that looked, for a moment, like a wagon well stuck in mud and the silhouette of a woman refusing to let go. Elias touched the whale tooth one last time. It felt lighter now, as if part of its weight had been paid forward. Voiceover, gentle. Every act of kindness writes a line in the ledger of the world. Tonight the book's balanced, but the ocean keeps writing. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the next chapter is already taking shape. The camera lingers on the 2 carved ivories resting side by side on the rail, starlight glinting off the tiny whales breaching beneath their shared constellation. Soft text fades in. If this ending felt like coming home, tap subscribe, because tomorrow's tide brings new storms, and every sailor needs a lucky tooth. The storm left as suddenly as it had come, trailing veils of silver rain across a sky rinsed clean. Dawn found Elias Finch and Lila Moreau side by side on the steamer's afterrail, the Coral which now lashed safely astern like a weary colt following its mother home. Between them, on the salt-stained wood, rested the 2 whale teeth, ivory warmed by sunrise, little constellations carved into each surface catching the first light like miniature stars. For a long moment neither spoke. The Java coastline drifted nearer. Emerald hills, white beaches, the slow curl of smoke from a fishing village, but the world felt hushed, as though the ocean itself were waiting for a benediction. Lila broke the silence first. "I never thanked you that night in the mud," she said, voice soft as the breeze. "You could have kept walking." Elias turned the tooth over in his palm. "Could have. Didn't. Luck works both ways, remember?" She smiled. The same fierce, unflinching smile he'd seen 9 years earlier, only now edged with something gentler. Luck or ledger. Either way, the balance is paid. Behind them the crews moved in quiet efficiency, coiling rope, patching sails, sharing tin mugs of coffee that steamed in the cool air. Somewhere below deck a pump organ struck up a lazy reel. The sound drifted across the water like laughter released after a long imprisonment. Lila reached into her coat and produced a small leather pouch. Inside lay another sliver of carved ivory, no larger than a thumbnail. She pressed it into Elias's hand. "For the next kindness," she said. "May it travel farther than either of us ever will." He closed his fingers around the gift. It felt warm, alive, as if it carried the pulse of every mile they had crossed and every storm they had survived. Years later, travelers to the Maritime Museum in Salem would pause before a glass case labeled simply, "The whale teeth, a debt repaid." The larger tooth, yellowed with age and salt, bore a star flanked by breaching whales. Its twin, smaller and paler, rested beside it. A placard told the story in a dozen lines. A sailor, a stranger, a wagon in the mud, and the night the ocean itself balanced the books. Children pressed their noses to the glass, wide-eyed, asking if the sailors ever met again. Docents would smile and point to the faded photograph tucked behind the display. Elias, gray at the temples, leaning on a boathouse rail. Lila beside him, wind whipping her braid, both grinning like thieves who'd stolen time itself. What the photograph didn't show were the letters, bundled with blue ribbon in a cedar box somewhere in Lila's study. Letters that crossed oceans penned in salt-stained ink, charts of new routes, sketches of constellations, pressed frangipani blossoms from islands whose names tasted like honey. Each ended the same way. "The tooth is safe, the dead alive, the horizon still unbroken." And what the letters never told were the quiet nights on different ships when Elias would stand at the rail, thumb rubbing the small ivory chip in his pocket, listening for the echo of a woman's voice counting out rope lengths in the wind. On the morning the museum opened its new wing, Elias arrived unannounced. He wore no medals, carried no speech, just the whale tooth on a leather cord, now polished to a soft sheen by years of touch. A child, barely 8, gap-toothed and sun-browned, tugged his sleeve and asked if the carving hurt the whale. Elias knelt, salt wind from the open bay ruffling the boy's hair. "Nothing that gives this much light ever came from harm," he said. "It came from kindness, and kindness travels farther than any ship." Behind him, Lila entered. The same storm-gray eyes, now softened by laughter lines. She carried a small carved box. Inside lay a third sliver of ivory, fresh as moonlight. Together they placed it beside the others, closing the circle. No speeches, no fanfare, just the slow toll of the harbor bell echoing the morning he'd missed his ship, and the quiet certainty that every act writes its own tide. As they left the museum, the boy ran after them, clutching a paper boat. "For next time," he called. Lila caught Elias's hand. "Next time," she echoed. Somewhere beyond the breakwater, gulls wheeled and cried, and the ocean kept writing. Voiceover, gentle as evening fog. Kindness is the only voyage where the destination is always home, and the ticket fits in the palm of your hand. If this story found its way to your shore, tap subscribe, because the next tide is already rising, and every sailor carries a tooth or two. The screen fades on starlight glinting off 3 small pieces of ivory, bound by nothing but salt, wind, and the promise that every debt, paid or unpaid, carries the weight of the whole wide sea.